What do you do when you spend 40 years burying your most powerful weapons under solid rock, and someone finds a way to reach them anyway? Because that is exactly what just happened to Iran, and the answer is going to change how you think about every unbreakable fortress on Earth. Before we go further, hit that like button right now, not for me. Do it because this story only makes sense if you stay until the end, and the algorithm only shows this to people who show it they care. Subscribe, tap the bell, and send this to one person who still thinks mountains can hide secrets forever. Now let's get into it. For decades, Iran had a plan, not a backup plan, not a side project, a core survival strategy built stone by stone, tunnel by tunnel, deep inside the mountains near one of its most important cities. The idea was simple, and on paper it was smart. If your enemy has better jets, better satellites, and smarter bombs, you don't fight them in the open. You disappear. You take your missiles, your production lines, your most valuable military assets, and you bury them so deep that no bomb on Earth can touch them. For years, that plan worked. Iran built an underground missile city, not a bunker, not a cave with some crates in it, a functioning industrial complex carved into rock, protected by hundreds of feet of stone and reinforced concrete. Assembly lines, storage chambers, access tunnels built at angles specifically designed to absorb and scatter the force of an explosion before it could reach anything valuable. Every entrance was a trap for anyone trying to get in the easy way, and every chamber was placed exactly where engineers calculated a bomb's shockwave would lose its power before arriving. This wasn't guesswork. It was applied physics, refined across 40 years of watching how other countries' bunkers failed, and building something meant to never repeat those mistakes. Iran's engineers studied every strike on every hardened facility around the world for decades. They learned what worked and what didn't, and they built their mountain complex specifically to defeat the weapons they expected their enemies to use. For a long time, that confidence looked justified. Strike after strike hit the surface of these facilities. Entrances got damaged, access roads got cratered, support buildings collapsed. But the deep chambers, the actual heart of the complex where the missiles lived, stayed intact. Analysts watching from above kept seeing the same pattern. Bomb the mountain, wait a day, and missiles would come rolling back out like nothing happened. That gap between what bombs could damage and what they could actually destroy was the entire foundation of Iran's military doctrine. As long as that gap existed, Iran believed it held real power. Not because its missiles were unstoppable in the air, but because its missiles were untouchable on the ground. Then, something changed. The United States had been quietly working on a problem for years. Not a new missile, not a faster jet. A weapon built for exactly one purpose, reaching the parts of a mountain that everyone else assumed were unreachable. It's a massive penetrating bomb, weighing thousands of pounds, engineered with a hardened case that can survive, smashing through solid rock and thick concrete without breaking apart before it gets where it needs to go. Most bombs that hit a mountain either explode too early, wasting their power on the outer layers, or they crumble apart before reaching anything important. This one was built differently. It doesn't detonate on impact. It waits. A delayed trigger lets it punch all the way through the layers of stone and concrete first, and only then, once it reaches the depth where the real target sits, does it go off. Think about what that actually means. For 40 years, Iran's entire defensive philosophy rested on one assumption. Depth equals safety. Go deep enough and nothing can reach you. That assumption had never really been tested against a weapon built specifically to disprove it, until now. When that bomb finally reached its target inside the mountain complex, something happened that satellite images and open source footage both picked up almost immediately. Secondary explosions. Not one blast, but a chain of them continuing well, after the initial strike had already finished. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. A single bomb creates a single explosion. A chain of secondary explosions, going off minutes and even hours after the initial hit, tells you something very specific. It tells you the bomb didn't just damage the outside of the facility. It reached something that was already explosive on the inside. Missiles, propellant, stored warheads, inventory that had been sitting there, protected by rock for years. Or in other words, the weapon didn't just knock on the mountain's door. It walked inside, found the room where everything valuable was kept, and set it on fire from within. Within hours of that strike lighting up satellite feeds around the world, something unexpected happened on the diplomatic side. An announcement came out that a deal had been approved at the highest levels of Iranian leadership, and that it would be signed within days. On the surface, that sounds like good news. A war winding down. A negotiated resolution instead of more destruction. But if you actually look at what happened next, the story gets a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting. Because almost immediately, other voices inside Iran's own system started publicly contradicting that announcement. Different factions said different things. Some confirmed a deal was close, others denied any such agreement existed at all, And on the very same night that a deal was supposedly being finalized, drones tied to Iranian forces were launched at commercial ships passing through one of the world's most important shipping corridors. Ships from a country that had nothing to do with this conflict. Ships just trying to move cargo through international waters. That is not what a unified government preparing to sign a peace deal looks like. That is what a fractured government looks like. One hand offering peace while another hand is still swinging. To understand why that contradiction exists, you have to understand something most people miss about how a country like Iran actually functions. During a moment like this, it isn't one single voice making decisions. It's several powerful, semi-independent military and political factions, each with its own priorities, its own sources of income, its own loyalty structure, and in many cases, its own willingness to act without asking permission from the others first. When a deal gets approved, the real question is, approved by whom? A diplomat sitting at a negotiating table halfway around the world does not automatically control what a regional military commander decides to do the same night, especially when that commander's unit hasn't been paid properly in months and is fighting for its own survival, not just the country's. And that brings us to the real engine driving everything happening right now. Money. Billions of dollars worth of oil revenue sitting frozen, locked in tankers that cannot move, cannot sell, and cannot generate income. Every single day that blockade continues, that number grows. This isn't some abstract economic inconvenience. This is the difference between an organization that can pay its soldiers, keep its officers loyal, and maintain its grip on power, and one that starts to crack from the inside because the people holding the guns stop getting paid on time. That financial pressure explains why Iran wants a deal badly enough to say yes in public, even while parts of its own military keep acting like the war never stopped. The diplomats need the sanctions relief. The military commanders need to prove they're still relevant, still dangerous, still worth fearing. Both of those needs are true at the same time, inside the same government, and they are pulling in opposite directions. Now let's talk about what's actually on the table in any deal, because the specifics tell you everything about what each side is really trying to protect. Iran wants its ballistic missile stockpile left completely out of any agreement, not reduced, not inspected, left alone entirely. That single demand tells you how central those missiles are to Iran's entire strategy. Missiles aren't just weapons to Iran's military leadership. They're insurance. As long as Iran has enough missiles to make any future attack on its nuclear facilities extremely costly for whoever tries it, its nuclear program stays protected by threat alone. Destroy the missiles, and the nuclear program becomes permanently exposed. Keep the missiles, and the nuclear program can always be quietly rebuilt later, hidden behind that same threat of retaliation. That's why this particular strike matters so much more than people initially realized. It wasn't just an attack on stored weapons. It was an attack on the very insurance policy that made Iran's whole long-term strategy possible in the first place. Quick pause. If your mind is already racing with questions about what happens next, that's exactly the reaction this story deserves. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling me where you think this goes, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because the next part of this story is where everything gets connected. Let's talk about the messaging coming out of Iran's military leadership after the strike, because the language they used says more than most people realize. One statement warned that wrong decisions would reset the entire board and that the world would see a different Iran. At first listen, that sounds threatening, powerful even. But listen closer and you'll notice something strange. It's vague. It doesn't say what will happen. It doesn't name a target, a weapon, or a timeline. It just promises something different without ever describing what that something actually is. That vagueness is not strength. It's usually the opposite. When an organization still has real capability left, it doesn't need to speak in riddles. It shows you. It demonstrates. Threats backed by real power tend to be specific because specificity is what makes a threat believable. Vague threats, dramatic language without details, tend to come from somewhere else entirely. An organization trying to sound powerful because its actual options have shrunk. And the events of that same night backed up exactly that reading. Iran's Navy declared a critical shipping strait closed. It wasn't. Hundreds of commercial ships kept moving through it, uninterrupted, the same night that declaration was made. Drones were launched at commercial shipping and intercepted before they could do real damage. A closure that isn't actually closed. An attack that doesn't actually land. A threat that never quite specifies what it threatens. Put those pieces together, and you get a picture of a military trying to project strength it may no longer fully have. So who's actually calling the shots here? That question matters more than almost anything else in this entire situation because it determines whether any deal signed on paper means anything at all in reality. Iran's official government structure includes a president and a foreign ministry that handles diplomacy. But underneath that visible layer sits a separate, incredibly powerful Military organization with its own chain of command, its own funding sources, and its own operational independence. That military organization doesn't answer to the diplomats in any meaningful day-to-day sense. It answers to itself. When an announcement says a deal was approved at the highest level, the real question is which level that actually refers to. If it means the military organization's command structure, that deal has teeth. If it means the diplomatic side operating without that military structure's explicit sign-off, the agreement is essentially a piece of paper that the people who actually control weapons and soldiers on the ground never agreed to honor. Given that different factions inside Iran publicly contradicted the announcement almost immediately, and given that drones were fired at commercial ships the very same night, the second explanation looks a lot more likely than the first. This is the core problem with negotiating with a fractured system. You can get a yes from one part of the government, while another part of that same government keeps fighting like nothing was ever agreed to. Both things can be true simultaneously, and that's exactly what appears to be happening here. Now let's step back and look at the bigger military picture, because the strike on that mountain complex wasn't an isolated event. It was the product of a much longer campaign. Strikes on that mountain range had been happening for a while, chipping away at the surface, the entrances, the access roads. But the deepest chambers had survived every previous attempt, protected by exactly the kind of rock and depth that made this facility so valuable to Iran in the first place. Getting a weapon capable of reaching those chambers wasn't just about building a bigger bomb. It was about solving a very specific engineering puzzle. How do you build something that survives smashing through solid rock at high speed without falling apart, and still has enough explosive power left over once it gets there to actually matter? The answer involved a hardened casing strong enough to survive that violent journey through stone and concrete, paired with a delayed detonation system that waits until the weapon reaches its intended depth before going off. That combination is what finally closed the gap between we can damage this facility and we can actually destroy what's inside it. And the moment that gap closed, everything Iran had built its strategy around for 40 years became vulnerable in a way it had never been before. There's also something worth understanding about how a weapon like this gets delivered, because it changes the entire calculation around how often and how easily a strike like this can happen again. A weapon this powerful doesn't need a massive, complicated mission to deliver it. Modern fighter aircraft, already stationed nearby, already flying regular patrols, can carry it and deliver it with precision guidance that adjusts in real time, even if the pilot has to maneuver away from a threat mid-flight. That means this isn't a rare, one-time capability that took months to arrange. It's something that can be repeated again and again whenever a new target is identified. That single fact should terrify anyone still counting on we buried it deep enough as a defense strategy. Depth used to be the ultimate protection. Now it's just one more variable in an equation that modern weapons have learned to solve. Let's bring this back to the money, because at the end of the day, wars like this one are rarely decided purely by weapons. They're decided by whoever runs out of resources first. Every day that shipping stays blocked, every ship that can't sell its cargo, adds up to staggering losses. That's money that would normally pay soldiers, maintain equipment, and keep loyalty intact across a massive military organization. Combine that financial bleeding with the destruction of production facilities that would normally be used to rebuild lost missile stockpiles, and you get an organization that is losing ground on two fronts at once: its ability to fight today and its ability to rebuild for tomorrow. That's the trap closing in real time. You can't rebuild what you've lost if the facilities that build it have been destroyed. And you can't fund a rebuild if your income has been frozen at sea. Every missile destroyed inside that mountain wasn't just a missile that can't be fired tomorrow. It represented years of production capacity, tooling, expertise, and infrastructure that doesn't come back just because a ceasefire gets signed. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding before we move forward, because it explains why the timing of everything, the strike, the announcement, the drone attacks, all landed within the same tight window instead of being spread out over weeks. Modern military campaigns don't destroy a target the moment they find it. They wait, they watch. They build a complete picture first, because striking too early on incomplete information means wasting an expensive weapon on the wrong building, or worse, on a decoy built specifically to draw that exact kind of attack. That waiting period is exactly what a temporary pause in fighting is often used for. Not just rest, not just diplomacy, collection. Every day of relative quiet is another day of satellites passing overhead, another day of signals being gathered, another day of patterns being mapped out until the difference between a real missile chamber and an empty decoy becomes clear enough to act on with confidence. When you look at the sequence this way, the strike on the mountain wasn't a sudden decision made in anger. It was the final step of a process that had been quietly building for a long time, waiting for the exact right moment to move from watching to acting. That's also why the timing of the deal announcement, landing just hours after the strike, makes so much sense from a pressure standpoint, even if it makes no sense from a trust standpoint. Announcing a deal right after your most protected asset just got destroyed isn't a coincidence. It's a reaction. It's what happens when an organization suddenly realizes the thing it was counting on to protect its future no longer can. Before we go into the endgame, I want to ask you something directly. If a mountain that took 40 years to build can be cracked open in one night, what does that tell you about every other safe thing you've ever believed in? Type your answer in the comments. I actually read them. And while you're down there, tap subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes next, because the ending is the part most people never see coming. Let's talk about the uranium question, because this is the piece that actually determines whether any of this ends in real peace or just another pause. Reports have made clear that what the United States wants most isn't just influence or apologies or promises. It wants the uranium itself. Not vague oversight, not a symbolic inspection. The actual material that sits at the dividing line between a civilian energy program and a weapons program. Iran's position on that material has barely moved in years. It insists its nuclear work is peaceful, open to some outside monitoring, but never subject to full dismantlement. That position isn't just a negotiating stance. For Iran's military leadership, giving up that material entirely would feel like giving up the country's identity as a serious power. That's why every previous round of talks, going back years, has stalled on exactly this point. It isn't a detail buried in the fine print. It's the entire disagreement in one word. But here's what's different this time, and why this moment actually matters more than the ones before it. For years, Iran could afford to hold firm on uranium because it had leverage to back that position up. A massive missile stockpile that made any attack on its nuclear sites incredibly costly. A functioning navy capable of threatening shipping lanes the entire world depends on. Oh, production system capable of rebuilding whatever got destroyed. Every one of those pillars has now been shaken. The missile stockpile has been cut down dramatically. The Navy's threats keep getting proven hollow in real time, with the ships continuing to pass through waters it claims to control. And the production facilities needed to rebuild any of it just got hit at the deepest level anyone has ever managed to reach. Take away the leverage, and the position built on top of that leverage becomes a lot harder to hold. That's the real story behind every headline about deals and drones and declarations. It's not really about diplomacy anymore. It's about whether an organization that built its entire survival strategy around being untouchable can adjust to the reality that it no longer is. And that brings us to the part of this story that goes far beyond just one mountain, one country, or one conflict. What just happened here is a preview of something much bigger. For decades, the entire logic of military defense for smaller powers facing larger ones has rested on a simple idea. If you can't outgun your enemy, outhide them. Build deeper, build smaller, build more spread out. Make yourself too expensive, too complicated, too well hidden to be worth attacking directly. That logic just took a massive hit, not because one bomb worked one time, because of everything that surrounded it. Drone attacks defeated by systems that never run out of ammunition. Underground facilities defeated by weapons built specifically to solve the depth problem. Mobile launch systems tracked and targeted faster than they can relocate and hide again. Every layer of the old hiding strategy just got tested in real combat conditions. Not in a simulation, not in a lab, but against a real, determined, well-funded adversary that had 40 years to prepare. And every layer failed. That's not just bad news for one country's military planners. It's a signal to every government on Earth that has been quietly building its own version of a mountain fortress, betting that depth and distance would keep them safe forever. The rules just changed, and they changed in a way that can't be unlearned. Once the world sees that a bomb can travel through solid rock and still have enough force left to ignite what's stored deep inside, we buried it deep enough stops being a strategy. It becomes a countdown. So where does this actually leave us right now? A deal may or may not get signed. Factions inside Iran may keep contradicting each other in public while quietly fighting for control behind closed doors. Ships may keep moving through waters that some commanders insist are closed. All of that noise matters less than the two simple facts sitting underneath it. Iran built something it believed could never be reached, and it got reached anyway. Everything else, the negotiations, the announcements, the denials, the threats about a different Iran, all of it is happening in the shadow of that one fact. A government whose entire long-term strategy depended on being untouchable just found out, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that it wasn't. And now it has to decide, with a damaged arsenal, a frozen income, and a fractured chain of command, whether to accept a painful peace now or gamble on rebuilding a strategy that has just been proven broken. History tends to remember moments like this one long after the headlines fade. Not because of who signed what piece of paper, But because of the exact moment the illusion of safety disappeared. For 40 years, that mountain was Iran's proof that patience and depth could outlast any enemy. For one night, it held. And then it didn't. Think about what it actually takes to build something like that in the first place. 40 years of tunneling, 40 years of engineers studying, every failed bunker on the planet, learning from every mistake, refining every angle, every wall, every chamber, until they believed they had built something permanent. Generations of planners staked the country's entire deterrence strategy on the belief that rock and time were enough. That kind of confidence doesn't come from arrogance alone. It comes from decades of evidence that seemed to prove them right, strike after strike, that damaged the surface but never touched what mattered underneath. And that's exactly what makes this moment so different from everything that came before it. This wasn't a gradual erosion of confidence. It was a single, undeniable night where decades of certainty collapsed all at once, in footage the whole world could see, with secondary explosions that kept firing off long after the first strike had already done its job. You cannot argue with that kind of proof. You cannot spin it in a press statement. Everyone watching, allies and enemies alike, saw the same thing happen in real time. That's why this moment matters far beyond the borders of one country. Every government on Earth that has ever looked at a map and thought, we'll just build it deeper, is watching this exact same footage right now, running the exact same calculation. If the mountain that took 40 years to build and was specifically engineered against every known threat could still be opened up in a single night, then depth was never really the answer. It was only ever borrowed time. Whatever gets signed this weekend, whatever gets denied tomorrow, one thing has already changed permanently. The world just watched a fortress that was supposed to be unreachable get reached. And once that happens, once everyone has seen it happen, there's no mountain left standing anywhere that feels quite as safe as it did before. The illusion did the heavy lifting for 40 years. Now the illusion is gone, and what's left behind is a country that has to rebuild its entire sense of security from a position it has never faced before. Exposed, watched, and out of hiding places. If this story kept you hooked until the very last word, that's exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what you think happens next, because stories like this one are only just getting started.